Hello, welcome everybody. Winging It is a show by Oddbird about web design development and our approach to solving problems. Today we are talking about relative units and typography with the co-chair of the CSS Working Group, typography enthusiast and self-described Panjandrum. Did I say that right? Alan Stearns, welcome to the show. Oh boy. Can you explain that for those of us who don't have quite a large vocabulary?
It was before I worked on CSS, I worked on a scripting system for InDesign, and I was the one making sure that it was consistent and it hit everything that was available and developers could use it for automation. And one of my coworkers described me as the scripting Panjandrum, which I didn't know the word at the time. It means a self-important, officious person. So because I was there saying, no, you have to do it this way. And so I'm doing that for CSS now, and I just like the word.
Excellent. I love that little history lesson.
It seems like a useful role for somebody to take on.
Yeah, I agree. And we also have Winging It regular Oddbird co-founder Miriam Suzanne. Welcome to the show again and again and again. Love to have you here anytime you're available. And you all are stuck with me, Stacy Kvernmo, fellow typography enthusiast. So I'm very excited about today's show. Let's jump right in. Miriam, where do you want to start?
Yeah, so I sort of pitched this one because I've been running into some articles and some questions about typography and particularly responsive typography. And I've been doing a lot of playing with my preferences in browsers, setting my default fonts to fonts that I like, and setting, like I like larger type, so why not bump up my default font size? But as soon as I did that, I had all sorts of questions about how we've been doing responsive typography, and not just at Oddbird, although we have been, but as a field, sort of the popular ways of doing it. And then I saw some articles that were also questioning things about this, and I thought, ooh, let's dig into it and let's bring on a Panjandrum to help us figure out what are the right units and the best units and the only correct units to use.
Here's where we find out. Only ones you can use.
There will be a single winner, and it's the only unit you will use from here on. No, I mean, I think that gets into sort of the first thing. I hear often that CSS has too many units. Definitely has a lot of units, and has gotten more recently. Are there too many? Do you two have any feelings on that? How do you feel about the number of units?
Alan, that's you. We'll throw that to you first. I have a few opinions, but I'm curious about yours.
Yeah, we kind of opened the floodgates at one point. We resisted adding units for a long while. And then we started adding some, and now the ball is rolling and we keep on adding more and more. I am a little worried about that, just from a platform perspective. We're going to run out of letters at some point. We've already gone to 3 letters because we didn't have enough in 2.
Right.
I don't want to get into like an IPv6 situation with CSS units, but I'm not sure we're at the limit yet.
Right. I don't even think we've used all the single letters that we could.
We probably shouldn't use those. I do like having at least 2.
Is there only the one single letter unit?
I think so.
The Q unit?
According to Winging It December, there was only one.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Have you ever used the Q unit?
Unless you count percent.
Yeah, I don't understand the use case for the Q unit myself, but that's because I'm not part of the typographical tradition that it comes from. Other people who have come across Q and said, why is it here in CSS? We should just remove it. Get very fierce pushback from the people who do appreciate and use Q. So
yeah.
it's,
And if you haven't, it's a 1/4 millimeter, which I guess in some typographic traditions is a standard unit.
yeah, an important thing. I mean, we also have PT, which is another very important typographic unit, but I'm not sure it really has much of a use
I
case.
used it like this week.
Oh,
Really? What did you use it
use
for?
it for?
For a print style sheet, I
Ah,
changed the font sizes to PT because I thought that would be a good choice, but now I'm questioning if I made
Well,
the
I'm
right
curious,
decision.
and maybe you know this, Alan. So there's a weird thing about the relationship between pixels and physical units, where on a screen, the pixel is the standard, and physical units are based on the size of the pixel. So an inch might not be an inch, but it will always be 96 pixels. I think it's 96:1. And in print, it's the reverse. A pixel will be always a 96th of an inch.
it is supposed to be the reverse.
It's supposed to be that way. Okay.
The last time I tested it, which was a long time ago, it was not actually the case, particularly in Chrome. But maybe things have changed since the last time I looked at it.
Okay, that's how it's specified.
Right, that is how it's specified. But it's print. It's a physical thing. It doesn't get tested in web platform tests, and so I'm not sure it's something that you can really rely on to work cross-browser. You can probably figure out how it works for a particular browser, and if you're in a printing situation, you're probably only using a single browser in your workflow. Maybe.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm curious if you know with points. I don't even know how points are specified. Is it relative to a pixel or relative to an inch?
It's supposed to switch as well, where on screen it is relative to the pixel measurement, and in a physical printing situation, it should be a physical unit, the actual point.
Okay. Huh. Interesting. All right. In a lot of discussions about units, I mean, it does seem sort of broadly, people want to simplify. So, we hear about a lot of units, and then people sort of say, well, which one is the one I'm supposed to use? Is there a best unit? And sort of, there's been arguments in the past of sort of pixels versus ems, which one is the best? And then somebody comes in and says, well, rems are the best because they're reliable like a pixel, but they're still relative to a font size. So there we have a best pixel. And then we get to argue about whether it actually works in every situation. Do you have a favorite or a best unit? Is there a best unit?
Yeah, I don't think there is one. I think there is a virtue in being consistent in what units you use across a particular site. But I'm much more in favor of multiplicity. I'm happy when people use pixels. I'm happy when people use ems. I'm happy when people use container query units.
So then how would you decide which one is right for your site or your situation?
Yeah, it depends on the content for me. And actually, I don't do that much web development. So I can't really tell you, well, I decided it's this one for my projects because I don't have that many projects.
Right. Yeah, someone in the chat is saying, I thought pixels were no good for typography. Oh, also, what about viewport units?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem that people have with pixels for typography is that you are then ignoring the browser's font size set by a user, because in every browser you can set your default font size. And if we use pixels on our site, we have all the control, and we've taken it away from the user coming to our site. And this gets into sort of the question that I've had about responsive typography. And I thought I'd give a quick background. So here's my 5 minutes catching up on how responsive typography has been done. Maybe I'll share my screen for this. Let's see. Try to find my way around here. Share screen.
Mine says present on the bottom toolbar.
Oh, interesting.
And then I will.
Which one is screen 2? Nope, I want screen 1.
Can't help you with that. There we go.
All right. Is that showing?
It will in a second, right? Add the stage. There we go.
All right. So this is Utopia.fyi, which is one of the tools that people use for sort of creating responsive typography. And I thought I'd come here because it shows sort of the old way that people did it. I mean, the basics are people are using viewport units like VW. So we're saying, what is the width of the viewport? And then create a font size based on that. That runs into some problems. Let's get a new pen here, a paragraph with some type. And if we say that the font size should be 5 viewport width, we get a nice and big font there, but boy, does it scale down. And again, we're ignoring what the user has asked for. They have no control. And there's even sort of a problem here where if I zoom in, the type gets smaller, which is also probably not something that we want. So viewport units not really safe on their own. So then what people do is start to put them inside of a calc or inside of a clamp. So the first would be to say, let's combine the font size requested by the user in Ms or Rems, and let's combine that with some amount of flexibility from the viewport. And then that works great on its own. But then you can say, well, what if I want a minimum and a maximum? And that's where things start to get complicated. So the way people used to do that was a lot of math inside of a calc. And I imagine some people are still doing this. I always sort of avoided it because it looked too complicated to me. I didn't want to read that. But then it got simpler with the clamp function, where you can just set a minimum, set a maximum, and then set the calculation that you want in the middle. So this works pretty well. And this is the way that people have been doing it quite a bit, including Oddbird. There's some things here with like, if you make things too responsive, they can become inaccessible, where you again get that behavior of sometimes when you zoom in, the type gets smaller. And so there's tools like Fluid.style that help you catch that problem. There's other tools that get even more complicated with this sort of thing, like Typetura, which gives you like an easing curve for how your font size is going to grow. We're not going to go into that a lot, at least yet. We can come back to it if you want to. But I thought I'd look at, so Oddbird uses sort of the simplest end of this for our site. I look for, let's see, it's on HTML, and I look for our root variable. Here it is, calc 1.25 Ms plus 0.5 VW. So we're starting with something slightly larger than what the user asked for, and then we're adding some viewport. So we're responding some to the viewport, we're responding some to the default font size. If you zoom in, it gets bigger. So it's doing these things in a pretty good way. I think this works pretty well. We sort of figured, well, we don't need a low end when we already have 1.25 Ms as the basis. It's not going to get smaller than that. So that's pretty safe. And it's not stretching so much that on a large screen it gets out of control. So we're not going to worry too much about a min and a max. Great.
So maybe the answer to the question of, what unit is best is none of them. You have to use them in combination.
Oh, I like that. Right, but then what happens is I come into my settings, and I'm in Zen browser, which is a Gecko Firefox fork, basically. And I say, actually, as a user of the web, I like large fonts. And if we looked at the font size here that we get as the default, let's go to HTML computed font size. We're getting like 25 pixels as our base font size already. But if I, as a user, say, I like that, I like 25 pixels as a base font size, well, we'll pick 24 here. And then I go back to our site, suddenly it's much bigger. That doesn't update right away. Yeah. So now I've said, oh, I like 24 pixels or 25 pixels. And I come back to our site and I get something 10 pixels bigger than that now. And that's because we've started from the user size, we've increased it, whatever it is, and then gone based on that. What are we doing? Is this the best way to do it? Or is there some other option here? This is the question that I've been asking myself. Curious if you have thoughts.
You know, I think getting bigger is so much better than being too small. So it's in some ways a fairly minor problem to be slightly bigger than what somebody has set their preferences to. But you do run into problems where that in the smaller screen sizes you run out of room really quickly.
I'm going to read this out loud for anyone listening to our typography podcast. Out of curiosity, what would be the reason for anyone to choose a small root font size like 9 pixels? My answer would be designers, and I am one of them, so I get it. I know sometimes designers like to have things really small and elegant. If you look at sites like, should I even call them out? Some of the high-end luxury sites, I'll say, tiny size of type. I think even smaller than 9 pixels, which I think is wild. And maybe I'm not the demo for that because I need to definitely zoom in on that. So I don't know what the use case would be for a small root size. Is there?
Yeah, I'm curious if this question is about why we would use a small root size as a web designer, or why I might choose it as a user as my default. As a user, the place I could imagine it is if I have a small screen and I really want to fit more on it.
And
that
good
could be
eyesight.
A use case.
Yeah,
a small screen and good eyesight. Or if everybody is bumping up their font sizes like Oddbird is.
and I could see it being a valid choice as a user. I'm not sure it's a valid choice as a designer. I think you should always start with something bigger than that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, looking back at early sort of CSS proposals and stuff, it was one of the questions that came up a lot and led to importance. Was if the designer makes the type really small, how can I solve that if I can't read it that small? There was a counter argument that was something like, if the law requires a font to be so large, how can I stop the user from making it smaller? I think that's a weird one. Yeah, I don't know. I've been playing with do you have this link, Stacy? Adrian Roselli wrote an article about the best base font size, the ultimate ideal bestest base font size that everyone is keeping a secret. And he basically says it's just not setting a font size because then the user gets to. I kind of like that as an approach. I've been thinking about combining that with a little bit with viewport. I like having a little bit of viewport responsiveness in there.
Yeah, I do too.
And then the other thing that I've played with is just adding some buttons to my site that let you make it bigger or smaller. So the default is medium, which is what you get, or the default is 100%, is your selected font size plus a little bit of viewport.
And
then
are you doing that just for the experiment, or do you think that there is some use to having controls like that on your site aside from the standard browser zoom that people would use for that purpose?
Well, there are two types of zooms that browsers have done. The one is just increasing the font size, and the other is zooming the whole page. And those behave quite differently. And only a few browsers even allow you the option of increasing font size without zooming the whole page. So it would be giving you that if the browser doesn't.
Yeah.
I have another question here. I've noticed that Chromium browser stopped offering a big range of root font size, and now it's just 5 predefined options, very small to very large. Any idea why they limited like this? I didn't either.
Yeah, I didn't either.
So no, we have no idea.
Though from a UI design perspective, having fewer, more easily discernible choices is sometimes better than a huge list of numbers.
Yeah, the other thing that Chrome has done that's a little interesting is give you a minimum font. I think it's Chrome, a minimum font size option that you can set in your settings.
Okay.
And it sort of acts like a clamp. It otherwise shows you the font sizes from the page, but never lets them get smaller than a certain size.
It is tiny to huge minimum font size, but only if you go into appearance and then you click customize fonts. There's a font size and then there's a minimum.
All right.
And then they even give you, oh no, those are just typeface options here. Okay.
One minor warning about changing your default font size is that I have run into bugs where SVGs respond badly to a default font size that is different than the 16 pixels that SVG expects.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, David here says, I worry about sites giving choices. Should it be the browser's job? I mean, I'm interested in that too. I think there would be I would like a browser that gave me more site-by-site choices. Like if I could get a little drop-down that was like, bump the font size, I don't know, bump the contrast, things
on
like
this
that.
Specific site. Yeah.
On a specific site, yeah. Because it feels weird to me to set defaults for everything when things are so different. And even how I'm using them is so different. Some places I want a lot of white space. I want big type. Other places I want to fit a lot of information on my screen. It sort of depends what I'm doing.
I feel like it's gonna be, it depends on all of these things. Or there's more than one right answer, probably a few wrong answers.
Yeah. I mean,
I love our simple calc M plus viewport width. It is very simple. I love that. As a developer who wants to be able to read everything and understand exactly what everything's doing, that is a nice and easy go-to, personally. But then you just showed me that thing, and I'm like, oh, bummer. I didn't even think about that. Anyhow.
And you set that font size, and does anything else depend on that calculation in terms of margins and padding and whatever else? Are they also responding to that change in viewport width?
Yeah, that actually leads into the next thing I was going to talk about. Although I was just going to show the redesign I've been working on, which has as many controls as possible. Because I think, in my mind, yeah, you can add that to the,
Okay.
and I guess I have a bunch of them set already. Let's reset all. But yeah, I have different vibes. I think terminal is a good vibe, but needs some sepia and probably a little bit of blur to really work. I let you do bad things if you want. But yeah, I was just having fun here. But to me, there's something about, the web is all about user control, and that's the fun of it. And so I should lean into that as a designer. I also let you remove all styles, but that gets hard to get back from. Yeah, I sort of like the idea, if browsers aren't going to do it, I like the idea of us doing it, of giving people choices. And the advantage of us doing it as authors is that we can personalize it. We can make it specific to our site. I don't know. Anyway.
And as authors putting these options out, if something, if it gets copied, if a lot of people start copying it, it may be something that goes into the browser eventually, because you're demonstrating this designer need or this user desire. I think light dark modes are a thing that everybody was doing on the web long before we standardized on anything
Right.
in the specs.
Yeah, and I mean, still you have to build your own UI for it. And I've seen a lot of people asking for browsers to put, I mean, I think that's sort of what David is saying here. It could be less confusing to users if the browsers would provide a consistent UI for that.
Yeah.
But there's no way for the browsers to provide a consistent UI for my weird idea of what a terminal vibe is.
Yeah, I doubt you're going to get uptake on the blur idea.
But, pessimist.
But yeah, maybe with experimentations like this and with more and more people doing it, we'll force our way back to user style sheets, which were a great loss, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Safari still allows them easily. They're still easily accessible in Safari, but difficult everywhere else. But I think part of that too, I think there's a reason that we lost user style sheets. I mean, when I'm looking back at early proposals, Holcomb's first proposal for CSS suggests how you can combine the New York Times style sheet with the Le Monde style sheet and get some combination of these two brands. But that only works because there's no custom classes. You're just styling tags. And so everybody is styling the same names of things. Everybody is styling paragraphs and links. And once you get away from that, you're not styling the same things. It's hard to.
Yeah, and in those early proposals, you had basically not an interpolation between, but sometimes an average between two expressed values, and that it was way too easy to come up with an incoherent set of values.
Yeah. Instead of importance, you had a percentage that you could put on everything. Right. And then you would get the weighted average of the percentages. And I think Bert Boss was the first to reply to that and say, what if I wanted blue on yellow and you wanted yellow on blue? Yeah. And we both said 50%. Do we get green on green? And I think it was scrapped pretty quickly. Yeah, but yeah, you were sort of asking a question that gets into the next thing I was thinking about, because I don't think Ashley was the only one to point this out. But I was reading Ashley Boyer's article, why you should use pixel units for margins, padding, and other spacing techniques. And this is somewhere that I've often used EMS for several reasons. I like my spacing to be related to the font size. The space around a paragraph, it makes sense to me that that would be based on the size of the text in the paragraph.
I mean, yes and no. If what you are spacing a paragraph against is another paragraph, then
Yeah,
absolutely it should be some
right.
sort of line height metric or something related to line height that you're using. But if it's, you know, if it's layout, non-text layout, then
Right.
I definitely agree that you can ditch the typographic units and just go with pixels.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, so the main point that she makes here, I think correctly, is that it's strange if you zoom in on a paragraph or whatever, you zoom in on a page, and not only is the font size getting bigger, but that means you have less space around it available, but your spaces are getting bigger too. You're using more of the less space that you have for your margins and padding, and that's a little bit backwards.
Yeah, I skimmed through the article, so there may be some things that I missed. But it seems to me like the biggest change in the example that was shown is just changing the layout. If you have less space, use a single column instead of trying to get two columns in there. The pixels versus M's spacing was, a rounding error compared to that huge change.
Right. That the layout itself wasn't responding to the.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, sometimes the relative space is the important thing. So if that relative space that's showing a paragraph separation, say, is important to the content, then you should probably continue using the typographic unit even when you zoom in, because if you lose that separation and those two paragraphs start to look like one, that's also a problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I started to play with this, pushing it even further and asking, well, what can we do now with CSS to sort of be aware of the amount of space available while also being aware of the font size, while also being aware of what else? What else do we want to be aware of? So I just created a little playground here. I mean, you can see the basic problem. So I've got well, that's a clamp. Let's just say that our spacer is 1em. And then we can see the problem that Ashley was talking about as we zoom in. Not only is the font getting bigger, but the space around the font is getting bigger, even though we have less space overall compared to our text. So that's sort of the problem. But then I thought, oh, well, we have clamps. So we could also respond to, say, the viewport inline size, and we could clamp that based on pixels. So we don't only have a single option here. We don't have to choose between M's and pixels or viewport units. We can start to combine them in different ways.
Yeah, and crucially, you don't have to pick a single value. You can say,
right.
My design needs to respond in some way, but within these limits. Don't get any bigger than this, don't get any smaller than that, and that's probably the right answer. You have to be thinking about min and max in addition to whatever you end up with.
And then I realized we also have rounding now in CSS.
Oh, yeah.
So we could even say, I want it to always round to some fraction of my baseline grid. Well, so
Right.
quarter of my line height. But I want it to be based on the amount of size available. So as there's less size, it gets smaller, but it does it in jumps, rounding. I don't know. Am I over engineering? Or is this a useful way to think about the tools that we have?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of typographic grids, so I don't think it's over engineering. I think it's good experimentation that should lead into whatever we eventually do for typographic grids in CSS. We still don't have a good solution yet.
Yeah, okay. I guess there have been proposals for actual baseline grid tools in CSS.
Yep. And some of the step functions are implemented for experimentation, but I'm not sure they're anything that I would want to use yet.
Right. Yeah, looking at some of the comments here in the chat, there's some talk about CH units. Richard Rudder actually has an interesting article that I should have grabbed the link to here. I wonder if I can find it. CH considered inappropriate sometimes. Yeah. I don't know how to add links to the chat. Here, I can paste it to you, Stacy.
I can do it, yeah. Or in the doc if you want.
I pasted it in the private chat here.
Okay.
Where he both takes credit for popularizing 60ch as the line length, and then argues that it's a bad line length. And your line length shouldn't be so font dependent. Which, yeah, I also thought was interesting. I mean, we've got all these units, which means we have a lot of things we can respond to. But that does mean we have to be careful about what we're actually responding to. So the CH unit actually downloads the 0 character of a font and measures it.
It gets the information from a font table. It does not do the measuring itself.
Right.
And sometimes fonts can lie. So it's not the most reliable unit.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of the argument here.
Okay.
He recommends using EMS or REMS for this sort of use case. I don't know, it's been a while since I read it, but I found it interesting.
Yeah, EMS and REMS are going to be more stable and more easy to test, particularly if you have a large fallback stack, because the CH unit is going to change depending on which font actually is used for the layout.
Right. Yeah, we also now, I mean, so the examples that I showed of responsive typography used viewport, VI or VW, that would be inline or width. Often the same if you're in a Latin text, but not reliably the same. But we also do now have CQI and CQW, which would be the container versions of that, which I've played with some. I've seen some people using those for responsive type. The trick is that you have to reset them every time you have a container. You can't set it once on the root and have it reply or update in containers. You have to apply it because a calc resolves before it inherits.
Interesting. I did not know about that detail. Because I think in most cases, using a container query unit is going to be most appropriate for the design, but if it's more difficult to use, that's an issue.
Right. So, I mean, you could create a class that's like my typographic container class, and then set your font sizes in that class or something, and set a container. But yeah, Also, the fact that the container has to be separate from what you're styling creates sort of another layer there of what's easiest to use. I have played with just do it on the root. CQ units fall back to the VI, or like a CQI falls back to the small viewport.
If there's no container.
If there's no container.
Okay.
So I'll set that on the root, and then sometimes I will set it again on containers where I want it to respond to the container.
Okay.
So you can sort of do it on the root, and then when you care, pull it in somewhere else.
I think I need to do some experiments with this because I really have not used container query units much at all. But they seem like an excellent idea.
I think so. Yeah. Stacy, do you want to get to the last question that you had here?
Yeah, I feel like CSS has so many awesome tools now to size your type or spacing or whatever we're sizing so flexibly, but yet these design tools are still sort of like stuck in like these fixed canvases and fixed sizes. Are there, Alan, would you say you have any tips of either how to use these or how to think about using these, if maybe there's some limitations, but are there any ideas that you've seen or had or used that you could share with maybe designers and developers trying to work together to create a more flexible, responsive workflow?
That's a really good question, and I don't think I have a good answer. Because, yeah you're right. You can't go into your favorite design tool and say, use this clamp expression to set my font size. I think it would be great if someone could figure out a good UI for that.
Yeah, it's hard, right? Because you have to...
I have never been able to figure out how to express that. And I've been thinking about this for decades now, because when InDesign first came out, we had the multi-line text composer that has a dozen different things that go into how you break lines in a particular bit of text. And it would be nice to give people the tools to fiddle with all those things, but it's the same kind of thing where the tool would need to be a graph where you can put control points on the curve and and how they relate, how this curve relates to that curve, and it's a really complex thing to express.
Yeah, that seems almost though like the way CSS works, right? In some ways, each of those control points would just be a property. Could you provide that UI in CSS? This doesn't solve Stacy's problem.
Thanks.
Well,
it's okay. Solving any problem is good.
I do think that there are tools that allow you to set like a default rem and then font size and various other typographic measures using that, using a percentage set or what have you. So you can change your base rem and have it ripple through the rest of your design. What I think is lacking is that min and max added to some sort of easing curve.
And the concept of a container would also be missing, at least in most design tools. And having the idea of a container somewhat goes against the sort of drag and drop approach to design. If you can just sort of create arbitrary boxes.
I'm not sure. I mean, because you can drag and drop those boxes and resize those boxes. I have at least seen prototypes of design tools that allow you to create containers and then style things within the container separate from anything else in the layout. It gets a little more complicated, but not that much more.
Right.
I have two tips for people. And one, Okay. Well, Oddbird, what we usually do is everything that we design in like Figma is a design proposal. It's not a pixel perfect anything. And I don't think the developers ever even like look at the font sizes used. It's all sort of like, is this optically relative to the other elements on the page? And so nothing is like taken at exact face value. No measurements are taken from the design. But I understand that not every place has a workflow like that. And I know not every designer and developer sit down with each other and like talk things through while they're working.
Well, and I think that relates to what Noah just said in the
Yeah.
chat, that design tokens help. Like,
yes, that was my
generally at
second
Oddbird,
point. Yes.
Okay.
we have design tokens set up, so we just reference those instead of.
Yes. Even in Figma, you can set up, they have variables now, or probably for a while, where you can set a max. Say you have H1, you can set a max variable, you can set a min variable, you can probably even have like, they have different modes. And if you want to work with that container, maybe that's a different mode that you put those variables in, and then you can remap those variables based on the mode. So we're getting closer. It's not necessarily going to give you a calc value at the end. If you're looking for measurements, it's still going to be, this is 64 pixels or whatever. But
like,
you can use those same design tokens, and they do change if you're in a different mode.
Yeah, so you can look up your table of design token definitions
Yes.
when you are translating a design into an implementation. But it still seems like it would be nice to have that that clamp expression exposed in the Figma UI somehow, and
Right.
maybe even to be able to fiddle with it. Maybe somebody
Or
could write a
calc,
Figma
yeah,
plugin to do
anything.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, with all of these things, you sort of run into also a process problem of, okay, so the designer fiddles with that calc and then sends it back to a developer. Does the developer now update the entire design system with the new fiddled with calc?
Yeah.
You have to have some way of documenting that. Yeah. There is never a single source of truth. There's always a bunch of people fiddling with little values. And then communication. Yeah. Did you have more there, Stacy? You said there were two pieces of advice.
I was saying how Oddbird currently
yeah.
handles sizing, and then how you might be able to sort of approach what I find might be the most useful. If you're looking for like responsive type situation, you can get close using Figma variables and like making aliases from the other sizes if you want a different container size. It would be a lot of setup. Probably not worth it. You can do the Oddbird system where you just kind of eyeball everything. And it worked. I mean, you use the design token, you use like, just use the same naming conventions as what you have in your design system or code base or whatever. But
yeah, our basic flow is
that
designers send something that we consider sort of a sketch, and then we make it real in code, and then we'll often pair at the end or go back to the designer and be like, did I get it right? Did I get the relationships right, the movement right? And then do final touches pairing on the final.
So I'm assuming that the responsiveness is really only in that browser version of the design.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be useful to be able to inspect the responsiveness in the design tool itself, Stacy?
Yeah, I mean, if that were an option, I think it could be very useful. Now, I don't know. I mean, a more technical designer might be able to make more out of that. But I'm going to make a big leap too and say it might more technical designer might know CSS. And I think those are the people who would really like to be able to do things like inspect and use clamp and calc statements and whatnot. Yeah, there's a slight disconnect maybe in like the designers. It used to be like designers would do things that like developers couldn't necessarily implement. And now we have all these new tools and these new ways of doing layout that like never happened on print. So you have to think of it's not like a canvas anymore. It's not just growing and shrinking. It's like things can rearrange and look different at different sizes and have different proportions. And that's one thing I think design tools aren't really set up for anymore. I think design tools are much further back. And I don't know, that doesn't necessarily mean designers don't understand that. It's just harder for them to probably do all the things spelled out in advance.
Well, and if designers don't have tools that expose those options, how are they supposed to think about it in their day-to-day flow, right?
Yeah.
If the only way to think about it is to create 6 different mock-ups at different sizes.
Yeah, that's a lot of work.
I'm not telling everyone should learn code because I'm not, don't at me. It's super helpful if you do. I think is the moral of that story is you can probably eliminate a lot of overhead on those. But I don't think you need to necessarily do everything pixel perfect. Like you can still design a thing on paper and say, okay, what do I want this component to do at this size or when there's other ones next to it? Like you don't have to do everything completely 100% pixel perfect in every scenario because that would be tragic.
That gets into our approach, which is like it's about communication. So it's about like if you hand me a design, I mean, you're rarely handing me a design because you can code it. But if you hand me a design, I'll start with a bunch of questions about how you intend it to move. And that communication is where that step happens. Also in going back to you at the end and being like, did we get the movement right? Are there ways we want to adjust it? It's a communication problem sometimes.
Yes.
I don't know. You were saying something too, Alan.
It's another bugbear of mine in terms of design tools and capabilities versus constraints. I think some new generation of design tools is going to have a responsive canvas that lets you see how your design moves before it gets to the implementation stage. But I think a problem that this kind of responsive tool is going to have is that there are going to be too many options. There are too many units. So the tool that lets you be more expressive and play around with the responsiveness is also going to need a way of saying, but here are the constraints that I have to work under. For this particular project, there is a best unit. We are going to use M's. And not allow the designer to use pixels or anything else so that it's more easy to reason about the changes that are going into the design and how it's going to be implemented.
Is that different from setting up design tokens and saying, here's the tokens you have?
Yeah, it's something like design tokens, but making the design tokens much more integrated into the design tool. It's not just a token name. It's a token that has these properties that affect the design.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Let's make it.
Okay. Well, one of
we
us
have nothing
works
else
for
going
a
on.
design tool company, and so
I had a proposal a few years back. It hasn't gone anywhere yet.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, I see in the chat there's another mention of like M's in media queries, which depends on browser font size. There's a lot of interesting things you can do in media queries. I think people don't always realize you can also use calc in media queries. So you could, if you're trying to do something based on multiples of this is the use case that I've seen for it. Sort of like when I have space for 3 cards in a grid, change something on my media query. So there's a lot you can do there with units. You can also, if you're using container queries, so media queries in M responds to the browser default font size. But with a container query, it responds to the actual font size of the container. So a little difference that you'll see in what container queries can do. Yeah, I don't know. Just a note based on that comment. Yeah, do we have anything else?
Buckle up. We do have a lot of outro here. Would love to know if you have any other questions about relative units, typography, or have any comments or anything to add to our conversation. Please feel free to post a comment even after the live stream is over. We love to try to respond and work with the community to see what people actually want to know and maybe what helps them. Oddbird is available for your custom web project. We enjoy working with teams to plan, design, and develop internal tools for staff, large-scale projects, innovative features, and design apps and CSS. Please visit. Like us. It does sound a little bit like us. All right. Please visit oddbird.net/wingingit to access today's show notes, resources, all the links that we mentioned to all the blog posts and the code pens we will put in there. And let us know your feedback. What would you like to hear on an upcoming Winging It? We're open to ideas of what you want to learn about as well. If you'd like to support us, please like and subscribe. And if you want more from Oddbird, we invite you to check out our newsletter at oddbird.net/oddnews. Thank you. And remember, best practice is a conversation. So let's keep talking.
Yeah. And Alan, is there anywhere people can find you?
Oh, no.
Oh, great.
I'm a lurker on most all social media, so please don't come find me.
All right.
That's awesome.
It's too late. I already have. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all. And we are out of here. Bye.
All right. See ya.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.